They thought they could control the neighborhood, until they learned the new neighbor was the new sheriff in town. Maplewood Falls was a town where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. It wasn't a place that attracted attention, and that's how the residents liked it. The sun hung low on a late afternoon, casting a soft golden hue across tidy front yards, and the occasional dog chasing after a fallen leaf. It was one of those places where the air seemed to settle in, like an old photograph that you kept on the mantel, familiar, calm, and seemingly timeless. In the midst of this picturesque scene, a moving truck rumbled slowly down Elm Street, drawing little more than a passing glance from the handful of people out and about. No one took particular note of the man in the driver's seat as he turned the wheel with practiced hands. The truck pulled into a driveway that sat at the end of the block, where a modest but well-kept house sat tucked between two others that had been there for decades. The man parked, turned off the engine and stepped out into the quiet. This was Jamal Williams. He'd just moved in, bringing with him more than just a few boxes and furniture. He brought change. But for now, he was just another face in the crowd. Or so he thought. Jamal, a man in his early 40s, stood tall and confident, but his first impression to the neighborhood was hardly striking. He wore casual clothes, nothing flashy or too different from the typical attire of the residents. His short-cropped hair and kind smile did little to separate him from the dozens of other people who called Maplewood Falls home. And though his arrival was anything but extraordinary, there was an air of calm about him. It was the kind of peace that many of the town's residents had long forgotten how to keep in their own lives. What Jamal didn't know as he unpacked was that this quiet town had a different kind of peace. A peace that was sometimes disrupted by the smallest things. The type of peace that was carefully guarded by a handful of people who believed they had the right to ensure everyone followed the rules to the letter. The kind of people who took minor issues and turned them into something larger, as if it was their life's mission to maintain the perfect order, even when there was no real need for it. Among these individuals were Karen Caldwell and Peter Martin, two long-time residents who had appointed themselves as the unofficial enforcers of the neighborhood. Karen, in particular, prided herself on knowing every regulation in the town's bylaws, even the ones that weren't strictly enforced. Peter, her right-hand man, shared her sense of order and rule-following. They were an odd pair, fiercely protective of their way of life, to the point of making everyone else feel like they were living in a fishbowl. And while they were generally well-meaning, they had a tendency to cross lines. That afternoon, they were on the lookout for their next problem. And in the distance, they saw Jamal unloading his things. At first, it was nothing more than an observation. Someone new had moved into the neighborhood. But that observation would soon turn into something else, something that would put both Jamal and Maplewood Falls to the test. Little did Jamal know, his first day in Maplewood Falls would be anything but ordinary. What began as a simple move-in would soon ignite an unexpected clash of authority and pride, one that would challenge everything this small town stood for. But there was no going back now. Karen Caldwell stood at the edge of her neatly trimmed front lawn, her hands planted firmly on her hips as she surveyed the neighborhood. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the row of houses, always on the lookout for anything that strayed from what she considered the proper order. To her, the perfection of Maplewood Falls was something worth fighting for, even if that meant going beyond the rules of the neighborhood association and taking matters into her own hands. She had no qualms about it. Someone had to keep people in line. Peter Martin stood a few steps behind her, nervously tapping his foot as he adjusted his baseball cap. He wasn't as bold as Karen, but he followed her lead without question. He had lived in the neighborhood for years, and over time, he had grown accustomed to her self-appointed authority. Whenever there was a complaint about overgrown grass or an improperly placed mailbox, Karen was the one they called. And when no one else stepped up, she'd roped Peter in to help her. He often told himself that he was just doing it to keep the peace. Today, Karen had her eyes fixed on a new house at the end of the street, Jamal Williams's house. From her vantage point, she saw the moving truck, the furniture being unloaded, and the brand new welcome mat placed neatly on the doorstep. At first, she didn't think much of it. New neighbors came and went. But something about Jamal's yard bothered her. It wasn't much, just a few scattered items that didn't fit the neat aesthetic she cherished. The lawn wasn't perfectly manicured, and the garage door was a little too cluttered for her taste. That was all it took. Karen turned to Peter, who was busy fiddling with his phone, and clicked her tongue. "Peter, get over here. This new guy is already making a mess." Peter hesitated for a moment, glancing down the street at Jamal, who was focused on arranging his belongings. "What's the issue, Karen?" "The issue is," Karen said with a smug smile, "he's not following the rules. He's got clutter everywhere. That yard is not up to par. I've had enough of people moving in here and treating Maplewood Falls like their personal dumping ground." Peter shifted uncomfortably. He didn't like confrontation, but he'd learned to follow Karen's lead by now. "You think we should say something to him?" "Oh, I think we should do more than say something," Karen replied, her tone turning icy. "We're not just some homeowners here, Peter. We're the ones who make sure the rules are followed. He's going to know that." With a decisive motion, Karen pulled out her phone and dialed the number for the local neighborhood association. She didn't wait for pleasantries. "This is Karen Caldwell. I've got a situation at 202 Elm Street. The new neighbor's yard is a mess. The clutter is ridiculous. We need to send someone out here to handle it." After a brief pause, Karen's eyes narrowed, and she gave a curt nod. "Yes, that's right. This needs to be addressed, immediately." As Karen hung up the phone, she gave Peter a triumphant look. "We're handling this ourselves. You stay here and keep an eye on things. I'm going to make sure this gets dealt with." Peter nodded, but as he watched Karen march down the street, a knot of doubt began to form in his stomach. It wasn't the first time Karen had taken matters into her own hands, but something about this felt different. Jamal Williams hadn't done anything wrong, at least not in the way Peter saw it. But in Karen's eyes, perfection wasn't just a goal, it was a requirement. And for someone like her, there was no room for mistakes, no room for anything less than absolute order. The rules had to be followed, no matter the cost. Karen approached Jamal's house with the confidence of someone who had dealt with far worse. Peter followed at a distance, his feet dragging as he felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He had a feeling that today was going to be more than just a simple complaint, but neither of them had any idea just how much they were about to learn. Jamal stood in his garage, wiping the sweat from his brow as he finally finished unpacking the last of the boxes. His new home, though small, was his fresh start. After years of moving from place to place due to his work, the steady job as sheriff of Maplewood Falls offered him a sense of stability he hadn't known in years. The smell of fresh paint still lingered in the air, and the sound of a distant lawnmower buzzed lazily in the background. It was the kind of peace he had longed for, a place to finally settle down, away from the chaos of city life. As he wiped his hands on his jeans, Jamal took a moment to survey his surroundings. The house wasn't extravagant, but it was his. The yard wasn't perfect, but he'd get to it. It wasn't something that needed immediate attention. He was just happy to be home. A rare feeling for someone whose life had always been on the move. But as Jamal stepped out of the garage and into his driveway, the sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see a woman with a determined stride approaching, her arms crossed firmly over her chest. She was tall, wearing a stern expression that seemed out of place in this quiet neighborhood. Behind her, a man trailed along, his eyes downcast, walking as though he were unsure of himself. "Excuse me, sir," the woman called out, her voice cutting through the air with a sharpness that made Jamal pause. He hadn't seen her coming, but now he knew. She wasn't here to welcome him with cookies. He smiled politely, trying to read the situation, but there was an edge to the woman's stance, a sense of authority that didn't belong to someone he had just met. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady but calm. The woman didn't seem to appreciate his tone. "You can start by cleaning up this yard," she said, pointing to the scattered boxes and a few stray items in his driveway. "This neighborhood has certain standards, and frankly, your property is bringing down the curb appeal." Jamal blinked, momentarily taken aback by the audacity. He had barely moved in. The yard wasn't a mess. It was just in the process of being organized. But before he could respond, the man standing behind the woman, clearly following her lead, mumbled something under his breath. "Yeah, you've got to follow the rules. People like you think you can just ignore them, he muttered, barely audible but still laced with an unmistakable tone of disdain. Jamal's eyes narrowed as he studied them. These people didn't know him. They didn't know what he had gone through to get here. And they certainly didn't know who they were talking to. But he didn't let that show. His calm demeanor remained unshaken. He'd faced far worse than this. I see. And what exactly gives you the authority to come onto my property and tell me how to manage it? Jamal asked, his voice even, but his patience starting to thin. The woman, who seemed to take it as a personal affront that anyone would question her, straightened her back and lifted her chin. I'm Karen Caldwell, and this neighborhood has rules. Rules that must be followed if you want to live here. And trust me, you'll want to fit in. Maplewood Falls is a place for people who respect the standards of the community. She glanced over her shoulder at the man behind her, who nodded approvingly. Jamal took a step forward, his expression unchanging. So you're saying the rules require me to tidy up my yard within a few hours of moving in? Karen's gaze hardened. That's exactly what I'm saying. You can either clean it up yourself or we'll handle it. Either way, you'll be dealing with this. She gave a slight smirk, as if she had won already. Jamal crossed his arms, leaning against his car as he let her words settle. He could feel the tension rising, but he refused to be intimidated. His experience as a sheriff had taught him the value of staying calm in moments of confrontation, especially when people tried to push their authority where it didn't belong. I see, Jamal said again, his voice low. And what exactly are you going to do if I don't comply? Karen's eyes flashed with anger. If you don't want to do this the easy way, we'll have to escalate. We can involve the neighborhood association, or we could even call the local authorities. We don't want to make it harder for you, but you're making it difficult for yourself. Her tone dripped with condescension. Peter, standing silently behind her, shifted uncomfortably. He didn't like this. He had seen Karen do this before, take control, push people around. But something about Jamal's calm demeanor made him hesitant. Still, he didn't say anything. Jamal glanced at Peter, his gaze softening for just a moment before returning to Karen. I don't need to escalate anything. What I do need, he said, his voice now firm, is for you both to understand something. But the moment Karen had been so confident about was about to change in a way she never expected. The tension in the air hung thick like a storm cloud ready to burst. Karen's stern expression softened slightly, as if she believed she had the upper hand. Peter, standing behind her, shuffled nervously, but remained quiet, unsure whether he should intervene or let his partner continue her crusade. Jamal, however, remained as calm as ever, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, a quiet confidence radiating from him. He had dealt with confrontations in his past, real confrontations, where lives were at stake, not this petty power play over a yard that wasn't even in disarray. He didn't let his patience wear thin, but he knew it was time to stop playing along with Karen's game. Look, Jamal said, his voice still even. I'm not trying to cause any problems here. I'm new to the area, just moved in yesterday. But let me make something clear. He took a step closer to Karen and Peter, his eyes focused intently on them. Karen looked up at him, clearly expecting him to back down or comply, but Jamal's steady gaze didn't waver. What you're not understanding, he continued, his voice cutting through the silence, is that I'm the one who enforces the rules here. I'm the sheriff of Maplewood Falls. The words landed like a bombshell, and for a moment, neither Karen nor Peter knew how to respond. They both blinked at him, processing the information, as if trying to decipher whether this was some kind of joke or mistake. Jamal stood there, unwavering, watching their reactions carefully. He could practically hear the gears turning in their minds as they tried to reconcile the man standing in front of them with the authority he had just revealed. Karen's lips parted, but no words came out immediately. She glanced at Peter, who looked back at her with wide eyes. It was clear that neither of them had expected this turn of events. The sheriff, this man, their target had just transformed into their superior, and they hadn't even known it. Jamal watched as the realization dawned on Karen's face, her initial confidence slowly crumbling. Wait a minute. You're the new sheriff. Karen stammered, the incredulity in her voice evident. The sheriff, Her words trailed off as she tried to gather herself, clearly flustered now. "Yes," Jamal answered smoothly, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm Jamal Williams, the new sheriff of this town. I've been here all of 24 hours, and already you've decided to give me a lecture about my yard." He raised an eyebrow, his voice full of quiet amusement. Peter shifted uneasily, his face flushed with embarrassment. He hadn't known. He hadn't realized the man he'd been so quick to judge was, in fact, the very person in charge of keeping the peace in Maplewood Falls. He could feel the weight of his mistake settling in his stomach, a tight knot of discomfort that didn't sit well with him. Karen recovered quickly, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "Well, I didn't know. I didn't know you were the sheriff," she said, her voice attempting to regain its earlier firmness. "But that doesn't change the fact that your yard needs attention. Rules are rules, and the neighborhood association—" Jamal raised a hand, cutting her off. "Karen, I don't think you understand. It's not just about a yard or about the neighborhood association's rules. It's about respect. The way you came onto my property and threatened me, it wasn't about the yard at all. It was about you trying to impose your authority where you have none." Karen's face flushed with the sting of being called out, but Jamal wasn't finished. "I understand you care about this town, and I get that you want things to be nice. But there's a way to go about things. You don't threaten people to make them conform. If that's the way you want to handle things, I suggest you think again." He locked eyes with her, his calm gaze unflinching, as if daring her to argue. For a long moment, neither Karen nor Peter spoke. The silence between them felt heavier now, charged with the weight of the truth Jamal had just revealed. They were no longer just dealing with a new neighbor who they could push around. They were face to face with someone who held the power to hold them accountable, and they had overstepped. Peter finally broke the silence, his voice small, almost apologetic. I didn't know, man. I'm sorry. We just thought you were another guy who didn't care about the rules." He shifted on his feet, visibly uncomfortable with the mistake he'd made. Jamal glanced over at Peter and gave him a small, acknowledging nod. "It's all right," he said, his tone softening. "I get it. But this is why respect matters. We all have to work together, not tear each other down over the small stuff." He turned back to Karen, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Now, let's leave it at that. I'll take care of my yard in my own time. But next time, don't come on someone's property unless you know who you're dealing with." But the sting of the confrontation wasn't over yet. This wasn't just about a yard anymore. The silence that followed Jamal's words seemed almost unbearable. Karen Caldwell stood frozen, her pride wounded, as she processed the reality of her situation. This wasn't how she had envisioned this encounter. She had expected Jamal to apologize, or at least shrink back in the face of her authority. But instead, he stood tall, unflinching, as if this was just another day for him. Her mind raced as she searched for a way to regain control. In her world, people listened when she spoke, and they respected her opinion, especially when it came to the upkeep of the neighborhood. Maplewood Falls, after all, was her domain. She had made it her mission to preserve the perfect image of the town, and her so-called authority over its residents was something she wielded with pride. To be so casually dismissed by a newcomer stung more than she had anticipated. "You can't just walk around here, doing whatever you want," Karen said, her voice rising, trying to regain her footing. She was no longer the confident enforcer she had been moments ago. The realization that Jamal was the sheriff had rattled her, but she wasn't ready to admit defeat. "There are rules, and they apply to everyone. Even you. Especially you." Her words were sharp, desperate, as she tried to regain control of the situation. Jamal sighed, his expression never changing. He had dealt with people like Karen before, people who believed their small corner of the world was their kingdom, and they were its rulers. But he was used to handling matters with a level head, and he wasn't about to let Karen push him around with her misplaced sense of authority. "I'm not interested in a power struggle, Karen," Jamal said calmly. "What I am interested in is making sure everyone in this town feels respected. That means you too. You can't go around pushing people just because you think you have some kind of right to do so. There's a way to handle things, and this This isn't it. Peter, still standing behind Karen, shifted uncomfortably. He could see the shift in the energy between them, the change in Karen's demeanor, and it made him uneasy. He had always followed her lead, but this situation was different. Jamal wasn't some neighbor they could intimidate. He was the sheriff, and he had every right to stand his ground. Karen's face reddened, but she didn't back down. "You think just because you're the sheriff, you get to tell me how to handle my neighborhood?" Her voice cracked slightly as her ego clashed with the reality of the situation. "I'm a concerned resident, Jamal. I'm looking out for the well-being of this place. If you can't see that, then maybe you don't belong here." Jamal narrowed his eyes, feeling the simmering tension between them. He could understand her need to control, but he wasn't going to let that cloud his judgment. He had a job to do, and that job wasn't about petty neighborhood squabbles. It was about justice and fairness wasn't about making someone feel small to feel better about themselves. "You're right," Jamal said, his voice firm. "You have every right to care about the neighborhood, but so do I. And so does everyone else who lives here. This isn't just your neighborhood, Karen. It's all of ours. But respect isn't a one-way street. You don't get to demand it, you earn it." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but Jamal held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. "Let me make this very clear," he continued, his voice low but resolute. "I'm not asking you to like me, but I'm asking you to treat me with the same respect you expect. If we're going to coexist here, we need to find common ground. And that means not walking around like you're the only one who matters." Karen blinked, her face flushed with both anger and the growing sense that she was losing control of the situation. She had been the one who made the rules in this neighborhood, or so she thought. The idea that someone, especially someone new, could challenge her was something she couldn't easily swallow. Peter, sensing the escalating tension, took a cautious step forward, his voice tentative. "Karen, maybe we should just back off for a bit. I mean, we didn't know." He trailed off, glancing at Jamal with an apologetic look. Jamal nodded at Peter, acknowledging his attempt to smooth things over. "It's all right," Jamal said, his voice softening. "I understand. But this is a lesson for both of you. It's about understanding where power comes from. It's not about intimidation or fear. It's about respect and mutual understanding. And that's something we can all work on." For a moment, there was a quiet pause, the weight of Jamal's words hanging between them. Karen stood there, still fuming, but her anger was no longer directed solely at Jamal. It was clear that something had shifted inside her, whether she was willing to admit it or not. She wasn't in control here, and that realization was hard to swallow. But the final lesson hadn't been learned yet. Jamal knew this wasn't just about one confrontation, it was about making a change. Karen Caldwell stood there, her arms crossed tightly, her jaw clenched as she processed the words that Jamal had just delivered. The sheriff's calmness in the face of her fury left her with an unsettling sense of powerlessness. For the first time in years, she was confronted with the harsh reality that the authority she so effortlessly wielded in this neighborhood had no bearing on the man standing in front of her. Peter, on the other hand, remained quiet, his gaze shifting between Karen and Jamal. The awkward tension that hung in the air was palpable. It was almost as if he had been caught in the middle of something he didn't fully understand. And he didn't really. He had never questioned Karen's methods before, but now, standing in the presence of a man who exuded such quiet strength and authority, he couldn't help but feel that something was wrong with the way they had handled this situation. The air around them felt thick, charged with the realization that a shift had occurred, one that Karen hadn't expected and Peter hadn't anticipated. Jamal wasn't just the new neighbor, nor was he someone who could be intimidated by a self-appointed neighborhood enforcer. He was the sheriff, and with that position came the weight of respect, a respect that was earned over time, not demanded through arrogance or threats. Karen's eyes narrowed as she looked at Jamal, but this time there was no hostility in her gaze, just a flicker of something deeper. For the first time, she was forced to consider the impact of her own behavior. She had always believed that maintaining control over Maplewood Falls was a matter of keeping things orderly, making sure everyone conformed to the ideal she had created. But now, she was faced with the truth. She had become the very thing she despised. an enforcer of rules without understanding, a self-appointed judge of others' worth. I didn't think," Karen began, her voice faltering. She cleared her throat, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "I didn't realize who you were." The words felt strange coming from her, as if the very act of admitting her mistake was a bitter pill to swallow. Jamal nodded, his expression unchanged, but understanding in his eyes. "It's not about who I am, Karen," he said quietly. "It's about the way we treat each other. We all have to live here together, and we have to do it with respect. No one is above that. Not you, not me, not anyone." Peter shifted uneasily, his voice a little more timid than usual. "I think what Jamal means is that we all have to be more mindful. Maybe we got carried away with the rules and didn't think about how it affects people." His gaze dropped to the ground as if he were ashamed of his part in the whole mess. Karen remained silent, her arms still crossed, but the defensiveness had faded. She let out a sigh, her shoulders sagging slightly as the weight of her actions hit her. Jamal wasn't interested in a power struggle. He just wanted to live in peace, just like everyone else. And yet, she had let her need for control cloud her judgment. "I guess I didn't think about it that way," Karen admitted, her voice softer now. She glanced over at Peter, who offered her a small, uncertain smile. "Maybe we've been too hard on people, too focused on small details, and not enough on what really matters." "Community." Jamal smiled slightly, sensing the shift. It wasn't often that people like Karen admitted their mistakes, and the change in her demeanor wasn't lost on him. It was a step forward, a recognition that respect had to be mutual, no matter what role anyone played in the town. "You're not alone in this, Karen," Jamal said, his tone gentle but firm. "If you're serious about helping this community, then you've got to start by treating people like people. We all have our differences, but that doesn't mean we can't find common ground. You're right. This town has to be a place for everyone." Karen nodded, still processing the truth in Jamal's words. It wasn't going to be easy to change her ways. For so long she had built her identity around the rules, around maintaining an image of perfection. Letting go of that wasn't just about changing how she interacted with others, it was about changing herself too. "All right," Karen said finally, her voice softer but resolute. "I'll try. We'll try. I know I haven't always been fair, and I don't want to make this harder than it has to be." She met Jamal's gaze, a flicker of humility in her eyes. "I guess we all have something to learn, don't we?" Jamal nodded. "We do," he said, his voice steady. "But it's never too late to start." Peter glanced at Karen and then at Jamal, a sense of relief washing over him. He wasn't sure how long it would take, but he felt something had shifted. It wasn't just about one confrontation. It was about building a town that worked together, that understood one another. And it started with respecting the people you shared that space with, no matter their title or background. The lesson was clear, but it wasn't over yet. The encounter between Jamal and the self-appointed HOA enforcers had come to an end, but the echoes of it lingered in the air, like the final notes of a song that had just faded. Maplewood Falls wasn't the same place it had been that morning. It had changed, one small step at a time, and that change started with the lesson Jamal had delivered so quietly, but firmly. Karen Caldwell, her usual bravado chipped away, walked back down the street with Peter by her side. She didn't have much to say, and Peter, who had been uncomfortable from the start, didn't press her for a conversation. The walk back to her house was quieter than usual. The usual chatter between the two was absent. Karen's thoughts were a swirling mix of self-doubt, reflection, and perhaps a quiet understanding that she'd miscalculated. But for once, that was okay. Sometimes it was good to stop and take a breath, to reconsider everything she'd believed to be true. Peter, though reluctant to speak up, was slowly coming to terms with the way things had unfolded. He had spent most of his life doing things Karen's way, never questioning the rules they followed. But now, with a new sheriff in town and a new understanding of respect and authority, he was starting to wonder if there was more to life than simply following orders. Back at Jamal's house, the sheriff stood in his driveway, watching as Karen and Peter disappeared into the distance. It wasn't about winning a battle for Jamal. It was never about proving who had the most power. It was about something deeper. It was about ensuring that the small community they all called home had a chance to grow and evolve, that people could walk into their lives with their heads held high, regardless of their background or their title. Jamal took a deep breath, the scent of fresh-cut grass filling the air as he surveyed his property again. The yard wasn't perfect yet, but it didn't have to be. He wasn't in a race against anyone. There was time for everything. He had made his point, but there was still work to be done. And that work would be about more than just grass and mailboxes. It would be about fostering respect, kindness, and understanding. The kind of community where no one would feel the need to dominate or belittle others, to feel important. As he turned to head back inside, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and checked the message. It was from his deputy. Nothing urgent, just a check-in. Jamal smiled to himself. The job he had chosen wasn't easy, but it was worth it. For every confrontation he faced, for every ego he had to check, he knew the job was about making people understand each other, about ensuring that at the end of the day, they treated each other like equals. He typed a quick reply to the deputy, letting him know everything was fine. As he pocketed his phone, Jamal looked back at the street. He could see neighbors walking by, some glancing his way with curiosity. The incident earlier had undoubtedly made an impression on them as well. But the lesson wasn't just for Karen and Peter, it was for everyone who had witnessed it too. For the next few weeks, Jamal continued to settle into his new life in Maplewood Falls. The small town slowly adjusted to the presence of their new sheriff, but more importantly, it started to adjust to the new sense of respect that Jamal's arrival had sparked. The small actions mattered, whether it was how people greeted each other on their morning walks, or how they responded when someone stepped out of line. There was no longer a need for overbearing control. There was no longer a need for people to feel that their power had to come from pushing others down. Karen and Peter, though their pride still bruised from their earlier encounter, began to adjust too. They stopped policing the neighborhood with the same intensity, and over time, they found themselves treating their neighbors with a new level of understanding. Karen even apologized to a few residents, acknowledging her overbearing ways. And though her apology wasn't easy, it was real, and that was enough to start healing some of the tension she had created in the community. Jamal's role in this transformation had been quiet. He hadn't sought recognition for what he had done. It wasn't about accolades, it was about the greater good, the idea that in every town, no matter how small, people should be able to live with dignity and respect. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jamal realized something. This wasn't just his victory. It was everyone's. A town had learned a lesson in humility, and through it, they had been given the opportunity to grow together. That was the real power. And Jamal knew that, in the end, it was this quiet strength, this commitment to justice, that would shape Maplewood Falls for years to come.